Well, we're ready to start our plenary session. My name is Jim Metsa. I'm serving as the MPD 2019 Program Chair. Before we start, let's make sure everybody's phones are on silent so we don't disrupt any of the presenters this afternoon. We have a packed program this afternoon. First, we'll be featuring lectures by this year's recipients of two major MPD awards. Dr. Jaime Sepúlveda, a recipient of the Robert H. Richards Award, and Dr. Kathryn, recipient of the Milton E. Wadsworth Award. We then have the privilege of hosting the keynote address of this year's Special International Symposium to honor his 90th birthday to Professor Emeritus, Mr. Douglas W. Fuerstenau, which will be starting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Professor Fuerstenau will be telling us about his 7 decades as a mineral engineer from the Black Hills to Butte, Boston, Berkeley, and beyond. And Barb Arnold, SME President, will be presenting him with a special plaque from SME and the International Minerals Processing Council to commemorate this event. In addition, the MPD will be presenting an award certificate to this year's winner of the Rong Ph.D. Dissertation Award. We also have Cyril O'Connor, President of IMPC, with us today to recognize 2 IMPC Award winners. The IMPC Distinguished Service Award to Professor Douglas Fuerstenau and the IMPC Lifetime Achievement Award to Professor Jan Miller. Let's have a round of applause for all these recipients. We also take this opportunity to thank ThyssenKrupp, industrial sponsor, for being part of the MPD plenary session, as well as track sponsor for the MPD plant design technical sessions. ThyssenKrupp is an industrial solution design supplier and constructs a wide range of equipment, including overland conveying systems, in-pit crushing systems, primary and secondary crushers, the Polycom HPGR, Policius grinding mills, pyro processing systems, and bulk material handling systems. Their extensive range of products and services are used in the mining, mineral processing, aggregate, and cement industries. Please give a round of applause for ThyssenKrupp, and if there's anybody here representing Tyson, please stand up, please. Thank you. Before we start, I would like to tell you of the launches of 2 special projects by the MPD at this annual conference. The first is our new SME Mineral Processing Extractive Metallurgical Handbook, which has been put together for many years in the making. The managing editor is Mr. Robert Dunn, and the editors are Komar Quatra and Courtney Young. The handbook is available for sale at the SME bookstore in the Colorado Convention Center, as well as online at the SME website. Rob, Komar, and Courtney, if you're in the room, would you please stand up and allow us to show our appreciation for all your hard work.
Now I turn the podium over to Barb Arnold, SME President, to introduce the keynote address.
Thank you, Nick. It is my honor today to not only introduce the keynote speaker of the Special International Symposium to honor the 90th birthday of Professor Emeritus Douglas W. Fuerstenau, but also to present him with a special plaque from SME and IMPC. Before I present the award, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the symposium's organizing committee members, Jim Gephardt, Pradeep, John Herbst, and Bridge Moodgill, who have put in a tremendous amount of work to put together an exciting technical program. Jim, Pradeep, John, Bridge, I believe Pradeep's not here, but Jim, John, and Bridge, would you please stand and be recognized? Douglas W. Fuerstenau earned a bachelor's degree in metallurgical engineering from the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, a master's degree from the Montana School of Mines, and a Doctor of Science degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he studied with Professor Antoine M. Godin. He taught briefly at MIT and then worked in industry for Union Carbide and Kaiser Aluminum. In 1959, he joined the faculty at the University of California at Berkeley, where he taught and conducted research, supervising 60 doctoral and 65 master's degree students over his career. Professor Fuerstenau was the founder, co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Mineral Processing, one of the most respected journals in the field. He was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1976 and named an AIME honorary member in 1988. For 22 years, he was a director on the board of Homestake Mining Company. Professor Fuerstenau was the first recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the IMPC in 1995. He has more than 400 publications and has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors. Please welcome Professor Douglas Fuerstenau to the podium.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that Dr. Pradeep is not here. He's one of the, as you heard a few minutes ago, the sponsoring behind this symposium and today, and he wrote me that he had applied for a visa in November, and our great government didn't come through, and which is really too bad. When I was a student, which is now a long time ago, was just the beginning of the growth of mining metals industry in this country. New companies formed. The mining companies formed large laboratories. Oil companies bought mining companies. I once talked with somebody I knew at Chevron, and he said, well, they just bought 18% of AMEX, and Arco bought all of Anaconda, and some of you know what was the result of that. And the construction companies were in their heyday, and then it turned around about 3 or so decades ago, and it all started to unravel. And while it was at the heyday, of course, enrollments in universities were great, and research funding, and it collapsed. And so now this country is dependent on, and we've already heard a little bit about that already today, on foreign sources for over 100% of a multitude of our metals and minerals. And a lot of those are held by two countries that are really not our best friend. And it really means a new search will have to be gotten. And then with the change towards a greener world, the requirements for materials that we haven't been at the forefront until now, like the rare earths, lithium is a problem, nickel, cobalt. And one that I've heard from outstanding mineral exploration person, copper is going to be a huge problem. With the change electric vehicles, I've read that electric car takes 3 times as much copper as a gas car. And that in the next 20 years, as much copper will need to be mined as has been mined in all of history. And my good friend George Brimhall, who was in economic geology, said, they don't know where it's going to come from, that magnitude. So we're facing with a major problem, and those of you who are coming behind me, you know, one of the real problems will be to have people, you know, and educate the people, and to pass on what we know. Well, when I was born, it was really the beginning of flotation research, not due to me, but and at that time, sulfide mineral flotation was really growing, and there were three people that were really the bulwark of research in flotation chemistry. Now, somebody's got to show me what to do. And by the way, before that moves on, a good share of this talk is just about where I've done and been and where I've lived, and a lot of it has a B in it, as you can see from that. And why doesn't that go? There it goes. Well, that's Professor Taggart, who was at Columbia University. And I'd like to say that when I was a student, I went down to New York and for the AME annual meeting. And Taggart was the first recipient of the Richards Award. And so I heard his Richards Award talk. And Godin introduced me to him. And so he's my academic grandfather, and like Jan Miller, you could call him your academic great-grandfather, using that chain. Well, Taggart goes down in history. Of course, you know about his handbook for writing, for proposing that the way flotation collectors react with minerals is by chemical reaction. That's really what one thinks of Taggart. The second person who did a great deal on flotation chemistry was Ian Warwick in Australia. He was supported by a consortium of industrial companies. We ought to have more of that in this country. And I met him in 1983 at a work symposium, and I got to know him quite well in that week. And there are two classic books of work that are still very interesting because he did such careful work by measuring, showing the region where flotation works using contact angle measurements. And the third one is Professor Godin, and under whom I studied. And Godin is really, I think, considered the father of flotation research or mineral processing research. And that picture was 1965, taken when he visited Berkeley one day, or a couple of days. A little shorter than I am, as you can see. A year ago, that's the remnants of my papers. Well, I'll start in the beginning. I grew up on a farm in South Dakota, and in the early 30s, the rain stopped and the Dust Bowl came, and I came upon that picture, which was far worse than I remember. But I do remember as a little kid playing in sand and dust along the fences, very fine dust. But this picture came out of the internet. It's from a town called Dallas, South Dakota, just 160 miles southwest of where we lived. Now that is pitiful, and that picture was taken in 1936, and I spent the summers 37, 8, and 9 on the farms where we lived, and they were back to farming. In other words, it had started to rain. But I can't imagine that in such a short distance you have such a drastic change. Well, due to the Dust Bowl, my parents lost the farm. And that's the farm we lived in. And this was taken in October of, I think, 1972. They were harvesting corn, it looks like. And I'd gone back with my brother Maury to hunt pheasants. I'm not a hunter, but he was. But you can see it's sort of flat like the airport is out here. But I'm glad they left the farm because my life would have been completely different. So after living in a couple of small towns in South Dakota in 1939, my folks moved to Mobridge, South Dakota. Then 1943, they moved to Rapid City in the Black Hills. And that summer of 1943, I had my first responsible job, which was herding 1,500 sheep with nothing but a horse in North Dakota. And I would leave the farmer's house at 7 in the morning on my horse, go about 1.5 miles, let the sheep out. The sheep would be out all day. At 6 o'clock, I'd put them back and go back to the farm. And 7 days a week, all summer, and I was 14 years old, and $35 a month. You can't even get half a dinner for $35. And so anyway, this is in the Black Hills. Now I'm only showing that's Mount Rushmore, and most of you in this room know that, but some of you may not have. And those of you who have been around for a long time, all that rock is now covered with trees. So that tells you, I took that picture in 1947, I think, and it's burned, but in that fire, it burned all my stuff. But a few things I had taken out and made copies of. So anyway, that's, I went to high school then in Rapid City, and in my second year, I came there as a sophomore. Second year, I was a junior. I found that if I went to summer school, I could graduate. And so the math teacher offered me a math course after school, which I took. I took the 3 summer courses, graduated, started the South Dakota School of Mines Technology in the fall of 1945. Most of the freshmen were returned GIs. I was 16, but they were 25. The oldest in the class was 34, and he's got to be in heaven long ago. So it was, and then after the second semester, the mass of them came in, and of course one had all sorts of war stories and so on. So, and I started to major in chemistry. But we hiked around the Black Hills a lot with an older friend, and you saw Mount Rushmore. Well, this is hiking in the Black Hills. We hiked up Mount Rushmore, and there is that's Washington Head in the below, and I'm the tall person, and the shorter person is Jan Miller's Ph.D. supervisor, my brother. I think he's 14. And those of you who are interested in lithium, about 2-3 miles to the left of my shoulder was an Etta mine. And I looked up just before coming here, because I remembered reading about it in a mineralogy book. There were spodumene crystals, that's lithium silicate, 50 feet long and 5 feet diameter. Of course, they were all mined out. Wouldn't that be a resource today? That's Jefferson's nose behind my head. You know, if somebody went up there today, they'd probably shoot him. But that was 1947. well, anyway, a letter came from U.S. Steel saying that they had jobs in their steel mills in Chicago in the process control department. And so three students went, and I was one of them. And in the summer, I was in the rolling mill. And the object was to look up what the heat of steel was. They take the ingots. That ingot must be about 3 feet square or so and about 8 feet high. And then you determine the heating cycle, which would be about 10 hours, I think, because it had to be uniform through. And then look up what the rolling procedure were. This was in the largest blooming mill in the world at the time. And I had to take the temperatures of these with an optical pyrometer, both at that point on a certain scale, and then when you go in where they were rolling it and take the temperature. But one had to look up in tables and do it. And I had that job at age 18, and the job was purely replacing workers on vacation. So I did that a second summer, and then in the open hearth that second summer back in Chicago. And I'll just, I'll digress just a little bit. I really believed in this summer job. And the next summer, I worked on a lead blast furnace crew in Bunker Hill Smelter in Kellogg, Idaho. And the summer after that in a flotation mill in Chelan, Washington. And so I had 4 summers of industrial, actually, working experience. So when I got a BS, I got a job offer just out by mail from U.S. Steel, which would be 1949. $245 a month was their standard. That's 20 times higher the starting BS pay today. That was $3,000. Today, from what I gather, a new BS engineering gets $60. Life has changed. Where am I? I wasn't interested in going to work at the BS level, so I had applied 5 places to grad school, including MIT, was admitted and all of that. But I decided to go to Montana School of Mines in Butte. And I don't know, I had a good friend, Frank Applin, who had gone a year earlier. And he probably influenced me. I don't quite recall. But Butte was, all the mines were running. It was a great mining place then. And I thought that experience, plus Montana School of Mines had long history in research. Godin was there for 10 years, for example. And so I spent a year there. And that's about the only picture I got of Butte. The colored ones I had burned, but that's yours truly. I used to could tie bow ties. I couldn't do it today, but that's in the background is Butte. In that area, they have a big sign in Butte says the richest hill on earth. They have hauled out an awful lot of copper, gold, and so on. So I was there 1 year, and talk about weather. 2 times, not once, but 2 times it hit minus 52 Fahrenheit. No wind. The exhaust from the underground mines, the exhaust went straight up, no wind, but so cold. And, but what I did for thesis research, Professor McGlashan, who was our thesis supervisor, suggested using chelating agents to try to find a universal collector, flotation collector for copper minerals. And I did find one reagent that actually worked on all the different copper minerals, including chrysocolla. And so that was one thing, by the way, that I did notice is I saw that with some of these reagents, they form precipitates on the surface of the mineral. And because like you put it on copper and all of a sudden you saw a little white precipitate, not right away, but they grew. And so there is definitely a surface reaction that was going. In other words, the bond between the reagent and the copper was stronger than the bond between the copper inside the matrix of the mineral. Let me back up. So anyway, I then went on to MIT and met Godin and Rush Spedden, who some of you know was an assistant professor then, and Phil DeBrain, who was assistant professor. Godin suggested to study and measure what are called zeta potentials on quartz with flotation collector. There are some problems in understanding it, so I built an apparatus to measure them by what are called streaming potentials. And for some of you know all about this, but some of you may wonder what this is about. Anyway, this is the electrical double layer. Every material, you put it in water, it acquires a charge. There's a charge in the surface, and then those charges have to be, the whole system's got to be neutral, so you have counter ions. And those counter ions have thermal energy, and so they stick out in a diffuse layer. Well, if you force the liquid past the solid, you're going to strip off those ions in the diffuse layer. And where the, oh, damn it, excuse me. How would it make the red go? Is that, which, oh, here we go. Come on, you. There we go. Anyway, where the shear plane is, the potential there is a so-called zeta potential, and that's what I was measuring. Now in flotation, what is important are anything that absorbs in what is, if you read there, it says stern plane. Stern plane is the first layer in a double layer. So what we want to do is look at what's happening there, and that's what we control in flotation. Well, I measured these zeta potentials, and the only one I measured at the time was the one for 12 carbon. This was an organic cation. It's ammonia, which is with a hydrocarbon chain on it, and it's a cation. So it's a positive ion. I put it on negatively charged quartz. And if you look at it, you see they all follow the same curve, but then all of a sudden they break away. And anytime Godin brought around a visitor to the lab, I would show my results as other students showed theirs. And I'd say, I got these curves with these breaks on. I don't know what these breaks in the curve mean. But if you look and see the curve all the way to the right, it's just sodium acetate. The others were amine acetates, and the 10 has a break, and 8 looks like virtually the sodium acetate. So what's happening? And the best thing that happened during my time at MIT was Godin invited Professor OVERBEEK from Holland. OVERBEEK'S the world's greatest colloid chemist and surface colloid chemist. And so he was in our group for the year, and I audited his 2 courses, and for 2 periods he talked about micelles. You take a soap, which is like up above there, and you increase the concentration, all of a sudden they associate putting all the heads on the outside and the chains on the inside. That way the hydrocarbon gets out of water. Well, it hit me all of a sudden. That's what's happening at the surface. And those breaks are when they associate, like the little picture I have up on top. But the heads are pointed to the charged mineral, so we called them hemimicelle, half of a micelle. And so that, I think, was really the main part of my thesis. Well, August 1953 was really the greatest month of my life. And the first thing, I was passing the thesis oral. And it had, Godin was away, as he often was, and the chairman of this oral was Professor Chipman, who is called the father of physical chemistry of steelmaking, so that was his field. He chaired my exam. Also on it was Overbeek and Carl Wagner, who is the great solid-state chemist, and Phil DeBrain, assistant professor. And I still remember this day clearly from Professor Chipman asked the first question, "Is this of any practical value?" of my thesis. I mumbled something, but this turns out to be of real practical value because where these collector ions associate, all of a sudden that's where you get good flotation, et cetera. But that kind of shook me. I passed. So the next thing that happened was Overbeek was returning to Holland, and this picture, which is a great photograph, Overbeek even used the photo. It had some other grad students on the right. But the one on the left is Harsuk Modi, who was my first doctoral student at MIT. And the second one was a grad student named R.J. Charles, Dick Charles. He did a lot of comminution, on the energy size, which really is an outgrowth also of population balance, ends up giving his equation. So he was one more year a grad student, then he became an assistant professor. And the next one, I became an assistant professor because I had passed my doctor's exam and even wore a necktie. And then that's Overbeek. And Professor DeBrain came from South Africa originally. August my marriage. Well, if you can do arithmetic, you know how many years she put up with me. Well, now I went back to work and one day got an idea about flotation and decided that the collector ions, if you have only physical absorption, they're absorbing as counter ions in the double layer. If you have, I had Modi for his thesis study corundum, which at about pH 9 changes from positive to negative. So you could work with a positive one or a negative one. And then it occurred to me, well, if we have a positively charged collector, the amine, or a negatively charged collector, which would be a sulfonate or a soap, one ought to float one opposite the mineral. And so Modi and another grad student named Iwasaki, Pete Iwasaki, had a long career at University of Minnesota. I told him, take 4 test tubes and just check this out. And, oh no, it won't work, they said to me. So they did it, and of course it did exactly that. If you look at the right is the corundum, which we did in 55, 56. And they cross it at pH where the mineral change is signed. Then there were some results from Iwasaki in 1969. They did a lot of work in Minnesota using this very idea on the iron ore minerals. But the one on the left is quartz, and you can see that if at very, very low pH, you can get some flotation with a sulfonate. That's a 12 carbon, like SO3 added on one end, so it makes an anion, and with the amine. But if you work at about pH 6, you can separate them. Otherwise, and depending on what mineral you have and what collector you have, it's and the idea really was very simple. And as far as I can see, it's the clearest explanation of some systems in flotation. Well, I decided it'd be very good to have industrial experience, and somebody came back to MIT on the faculty, had been 7 years with Inland Steel in their research, and I talked to him a long time, a lot of days, and about leaving and getting some industrial experience in research. And I had a letter inviting me to come for an interview at Union Carbide in Niagara Falls, which I went. Russ Spedden, who was had gone there as group manager in their mineral engineering and chemical engineering. Obviously, he was responsible for that. Must have cleared it with Godin, and so I went there and interviewed, and they had a job offer that doubled my pay, which actually helped a little. And I'll back up a little bit. Dick Charles became an assistant professor for 1 year, started a comminution program. He got a lot of companies to support him. And he said, I can't live on this pay. And so he left, and he went to GE, and Godin said, well, why don't you take over his comminution stuff? Because he had this program on it, which I did. And so that got me started in comminution. And so I went to Niagara Falls, and for Union Carbide, had a large metals research lab, excellent lab with very outstanding staff, researchers. And in mineral engineering, mineral processing, Spedden had put together a fantastically good lab. They must have given him an open checkbook, because it was totally equipped in all sorts of directions. And so I was the section leader in the mineral engineering section. And we worked on things like manganese ores, battery grade manganese. That was a big problem. Remember tungsten, ores, materials that Union Carbide was involved with. And Carbide had a huge ferroalloy plant there in Niagara Falls. So obviously, electric furnaces and the power off the waterfall, that waterfall. And so I was there 2 years, and one day I was called down to the office, and I was told that I was given what was called the Hardy Gold Medal, the first recipient. It's now all in TMS AME. And that's Russ Spedden on the right, and of course yours truly, and Barney Field, the manager of the lab, and the person on the left was the person handing it out. And one thing I did, I now remember before I pass along, we had to, in this pilot plant facility, had a large vibratory ball mill, had to grind 5 tons of chromite for a solid state reduction process. So I had the technicians vary the conditions of the grinding and of this vibratory ball mill, and wrote a paper that eventually, a couple of years later, resulted in the Rossiter Raymond Award. Just by, instead of just doing a job that was not research, but made it research. So one day I had a call from somebody from Kaiser Aluminum who said he'd like to come and talk to me about them. And so he came to Niagara Falls and took Peg and me out to dinner. And I still remember he said, well, he'd been away from home 59% of the time. Didn't impress a wife very much to hear that. But the problem that Kaiser had is they were a one-source bauxite source, which is soil from Jamaica. And a hurricane destroyed the dock, and they were left without bauxite. And so they put in a huge program of finding bauxite sources. And then they had a small lab, to try to ascertain and producing alumina from these. So I agreed to go out to California and interviewed them, and they offered me a job, and I said, I want 50% more money. They gave it to me. Then I turned them down. I said, I'd already started to talk about going to Berkeley. And they then said, well, you come out for the interim year. So we did. So we moved there in the fall of '58. So I had a tour with visiting some prospects they had in Alabama and South Carolina. There's soil in that area that's high gibbsite. You know, it's all red if you've driven through there, and it's got a lot of gibbsite in it. Then I went and visited their Bear plant in Baton Rouge, and their reduction one in Chalmette right near New Orleans. But the thing is interesting interesting or uninteresting, I don't know what you want to say. The red mud from the Bear plant, they just dumped in the Mississippi River. And 200 miles later, it came up. And now they, of course, impound it, but that was their tailings disposal. But you know, Homestake Mine in South Dakota, for 100 years, their tailings went down Whitewood Creek and out to the Missouri River, out. Some of it made the Mississippi Delta. Only about 1975, they finally impounded their tailings too. So one other part of the Kaiser, they did have big exploration programs in Brazil and in French Guiana. So I went with a chief mining engineer and chief geologist there up the Amazon and looking at samples and getting samples to bring back to test. And one thing I got out was malaria, which came back once, but never again. And but after I left, their geologists found huge deposits of bauxite in Queensland in Australia, and that I assume solved all their problems. So in the fall of '59, I moved to University of California in Berkeley. This is Hearst Mining Building, first built about 1905-6 by Phoebe Hearst, the wife of George Hearst. George Hearst founded Homestake, Anaconda. When Hearst died, he owned 39% of Anaconda, and his wife built this building in honor of him at the University of California, Berkeley. And the university, which has 10 campuses, considers this the prima donna building of the whole university. Inside, it's not the best lab building, but so it now is isolated from the ground. It sits on big isolators, so if there's an earthquake, it won't be destroyed. And the Hayward Fault goes about a block to the right. So anyway, I joined there, and eventually started a large research program that my object was to uncover, the basic fundamentals of all of the aspects of, processing minerals, and in the mineral processing itself, or the surface chemistry, and also, as we all know, you've got with an ore, you must liberate the values, and so I also included a large part of our program was on comminution. Schernert started a program on comminution research under Professor Rumpf, where they broke single particles. They actually broke particles down to 10 microns particles under a microscope and determined their breakage behavior as single particles. Then they went to particles in beds, and Schernert started to look at the energy involved and said, hey, this is a lot energetically better than ball milling, and dreamt up the idea of a high pressure roll mill to do this job. So that is Schernert. It was our lab in Berkeley, I think 2003, and that lab model, the part that's orange, he was building another one for himself, and I said, well, why don't you build a second one and for us? And so they were built in his shops at the University of Clausthal in Germany, and then we put all the rest together. And so that mill is now in Utah, and made a Ph.D. thesis not more than a handful of years ago. And as I say, that's Klaus, who died in 1984. Anyway, several people did thesis work with that mill and other instrumented mills that we had. I've got the simplest way to present the results as reduction ratio versus the energy. Reduction ratio is the feed divided by the mean of the size of the product. To measure the energy for a single particle breakage, you have to have a narrow size. So we compared the narrow size both in ball milling, narrow size feed. And you can see that the single particle mill is the most efficient, followed by particle bed, and inefficient is the ball mill. And down in the bottom, you can see that the ball mill is only about 41% as efficient energetically, where at a reduction ratio of 6, as is single particle crushing, and that high pressure roll mill is there in between. And by the way, with this high pressure grinding rolls, at very high pressures, they cross with the ball mill because then the ball mill becomes more efficient because there's compression within that particle bed. So the object is to operate in between. Now Schernert he was constantly working on closed circuit grinding, which we heard a little about today. And whereas what we've done is what we called hybrid grinding, one pass through the roll mill, then take that to the ball mill, and which is what, like at Cerro Verde in that big Freeport operation, Peru, 395,000 tons a day. Amazing. They run them through grinding rolls and through ball mills. And Schernert got the patent. University of Karlsruhe let him patent it. And in Germany, he took the patent to Ph.D. and to Pelusius. Pelusius is now Tyson and something they call it. At one point, I remember Klaus telling me there are 300 of these mills in the cement plants, And now they're growing in hard rock mining, as you know. I'll just throw a little bit more in on flotation research. This is with bastnasite, which is a rare earth fluorocarbonate, and this was out of Dr. Pradeep's doctoral thesis. But if you look at the bottom curve, the problem is with the bastnasite, it's mixed with calcite, and barite, and lots of other carbonates. But if you look at and what we did is worked with this hydroxamate chelating collector. You can see on barite, it just grows up to a monolayer. Well, that must be chemisorption. What I showed you earlier is what we'd call physical adsorption. There's no chemistry involved. It's just the physics. But you look at the calcite, and you see that it absorbs on the surface, and then as you add more, all of a sudden it takes off in a large way. That's got to be converted to chemical reaction at that point. Now you look at the bastnasite, the uptake of that is tremendous. Many times a monolayer. It's far beyond a monolayer. It's grown up as a chemical compound. And it actually shows up in the flotation behavior that you can see that bastnasite at low concentrations, collector concentrations, is floating very well. And we were given money to start this work, not the hydroxamate stuff, by Molycorp, which Molycorp, has that Mountain Pass operation. It used to be only one in California, only one in the U.S., and they gave us money to start with. But then Pradeep wanted to do both basic and applied research, and that's where this grew out of. This little figure shows you the differences between chemisorption and physical adsorption. On the top, that's with MnO2. Only when below that, what's called PZC there, about pH 6, or I think it is, only when the pHs are below that will it respond to flotation. It's because the anion absorbs on the positively charged mineral. But where you have the hydroxamate, it only absorbs when it's negatively charged. And then when the pKa of hydroxamate is about pH 9, so when it turns around and starts producing anions, flotation drops off, as you can see at high pHs. Now you take a oleate of a soap. Oleate is a common flotation reagent. At pH is above the PZC, the oleate floats MnO2. It's got to be chemisorption. And now you go below that as you drop the pH towards the PZC, where it reverses from a negative surface to a positive, it starts floating again. That's now because the positive surface is absorbing some of those negative soap ions. But why the chemisorption takes place, it obviously has to be some chemical interaction between the metal ion in the lattice of the MnO2. But how that negative oleate gets to the surface is interesting. It's not repelled. I still haven't quite figured that one out. Well, anyway, just to come more towards the end of this, I spent a lot of effort, but not interrupting with my teaching, of being involved with technical societies and organizing symposiums and National Research Council committees on the editorial boards of a lot of journals, which I think everybody should give their time and intellectual efforts in that direction. That's really what keeps us all the field moving ahead. Well, one other thing that I got involved with, which was a great asset, was joining the board of Homestake Mining Company, which gave one a corporate outlook towards the mining industry. New mines, prospects, the financial thing. It was something I did for 22 years. And I sort of like that picture. That's Fimiston Mine near Kalgoorlie in Australia. Annually was a board trip to one of the operations, let's say. And that miner looks very interested. And this was just at the beginning of what now they call in Australia the super pit. This super pit is maybe a mile long and a kilometer or something wide and maybe that much deep and now. And that was half owned by Homestake. And this Fimiston mine, I suppose, was gone now. It was incorporated into that. But that added a great deal. And so the last, I'll just show one more picture. This photo was taken in April 1974. Tony Godin in the middle, and my brother Maury, who you know on the left, and yours truly. And 4 or 5 months later than that, Godin died. He looks pretty healthy there, but he had a stroke and I think cancer was brought it about. He was 74. My brother reached 79. And I reached 90. Anyway, thank you.